like to turn back to our guests in the studio. We have Jonathan Conricus in the studio with us. He's a former international spokesperson of the IDF, and we have Oren Kessler, political analyst and author. Okay, so I want to talk about policy because all we've been talking about is a deadlock and how these different blocs are going to actually form a government. But, you know, we spoke about this earlier. We ended our last conversation talking about the issues that Israelis care about the most. Cost of living has been the one that we saw, you know, everybody talking about. 44% of Israelis said that they're voting based on how to lower the cost of living. Who actually has a proposal in place to make this happen? Is anybody presented anything?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
As Jonathan mentioned, elections in Israel tend to be very tribal and identity-based, and not necessarily on substantive issues. It's an issue we see around the world where people tend to just sort of align with their tribe. You know, in many ways, I think. I think a lot of people looking at Israel from outside think that we're constantly talking about two-state solution and Israelis and Palestinians. Within Israel, it's much more bread and butter issues, of which one is certainly security, without a doubt. But cost of living, education, security, I think, are the big three. And one other issue, if I may, on the policy front, I think the elephant in the room is indeed Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionism party. I think substantively, not on economic issues, but in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think they've really injected a new element into this, a new conversation into this election, where people like Ben-Gvir have called for transferring out, Arabs who won't sign on to a loyalty declaration, for example.
Right.
So on those substantive issues, I mean, it's hard for me to believe that will actually ever happen. But on those substantive issues, I think there is a real difference between the two blocs. On economics, I'm not that sure.
All right, so that actually leads me to the next question, and I'd like you, Jonathan, to kind of give us a sense of what you think will happen if Netanyahu is able to form a government and is able to somehow get some more seats past the 60 that have, been predicted by the polls. What will that government look like? What kind of policies can we be expecting to see passed?
So, judging from recent past in Israel, you can't really say that different governments have made significant different policies. Sure, there have been more budgets allocated to other parts of society, depending on who was in government. But in terms of real policy, I personally think that is one of the biggest shortcomings of the Israeli system. I think that the Israeli political system is, in a sense, failing the country, because we find ourselves in this deadlock time and time again, and politicians, instead of focusing on long-term planning, on strategic, deep long-term planning, really setting the priorities for the country, where do we want to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? Instead of that, it's all tribal politics, it's identity-based politics, and it's the person and not the idea and not the agenda. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we face as a democratic country, with having, as you said, I think you said 39 parties eligible. That is simply too much. And in terms of actually implementing any meaningful policy that makes any meaningful influence on the state of Israel, it makes it very difficult. So the bottom line of that is that I'm happy, and it gives me security that there are strong and substantial and well-governed institutions in Israel, the IDF being one of them, but not the only one, who, while politicians are doing their thing, steady the ship and focus on what really needs to be done.
All right, well, that still doesn't fully answer our question about what a Netanyahu-led bloc-led government is going to look like. Could you give us some insight? I really just kind of want to break down. I know you guys are repeating this, and it's true. We haven't really heard anything about what these governments are really going to do. And so it is a hard question to answer. But give us a sense of what Netanyahu stands for today, what his religious right-wing bloc stands for today.
So we Israelis know Netanyahu fairly well. He was prime minister for 12 years. Mm-hmm. This may be sort of his last stand. If he doesn't pull this off, some analysts think that this may be the end of the road for him. But he's the ultimate survivor, and he's been the longest serving Israeli prime minister. We know him fairly well. As I mentioned earlier, the sort of new ingredient is this new coalition partner, which is forecast to, Religious Zionism, which is forecast to take 13 or 14 seats and become the third biggest party in the Knesset. So that's kind of a wild card that we're not very familiar with. But in terms of Netanyahu, we know essentially what his impulses are on security, on economics. He's very much a free marketeer. I think we can expect more. Well, like everything in Israel, that's more complicated because he has ultra-Orthodox coalition partners who he needs to satisfy. But his impulses are more towards the free market, whereas if Lapid were able to pull it off, his left-wing bloc includes some leftist parties that are less inclined in that direction. I will say just briefly one thing. One of the major economic issues that's been on the agenda recently is this gas agreement with Lebanon, in which after 10 years, Israel and Lebanon finally agreed how to split this gas field that straddles the border. And Netanyahu came out thundering against it because, of course, it was under Lapid's government that it was signed, saying this is a surrender, this is a betrayal, and that he's going to undo it. I'm skeptical he'd actually undo it, but so he claims.